So we're going to begin our infrastructure presentation with a 20-minute broad-ranging presentation, and I'd like to ask Nadine Ibrahim to start us off. Nadine.
All right, thank you, Clarence. I have the pleasure to present to you the researchers behind this topic here. So we'll start off the infrastructure piece with the topic titled, Can Our Public Infrastructure Weather the COVID-19 Storm? With a little pun on words here. And the water-related infrastructure that is the first piece here is really 4 topics in one, and the speakers will be in that order. So it'll be starting off with the wastewater infrastructure, being the wastewater that has traces of all human activity. So wastewater will be our starting point with Wayne Parker presenting, followed by stormwater with Bruce McViker presenting, and then drinking water with Kimia Agasadegi presenting, and then we'll wrap it up with asset management being the one that encompasses the operations and the financials and the decision-making around the public infrastructure with Annalisa Schmidt to wrap it off. And we are all in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Waterloo, and we'll pass on the microphone from one to the other as we go through the presentation. So I'll pass it over to you, Wayne.
Great. Thank you very much, Nadine. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about wastewater infrastructure and its relationship to the pandemic. Maybe we'll move to the next slide, please. So at the very outset, when the pandemic was in early days, in the wastewater community, the early concerns were really whether the active virus might be present in the wastewater through people's releases. So luckily, at least for this virus, it was identified that the active virus is not excreted by humans, and hence, from the standpoint of things like worker safety, people who might be handling wastewaters and so on, and also releases to the environment, that this was not likely an issue when it came to the virus itself. Never say that, in future pandemics, that may not necessarily hold true, as every virus is unique into itself. One of the things that is kind of interesting that has really is probably the hottest topic in wastewater research in the last 4 months is the idea of using viral RNA fingerprints in the wastewater as a way to do a community level appraisal of the level of infection in communities. And that is something that, as we talk about rebounds and spikes in infection and so on, and implementing control measures, that the region may want to consider more going forward as a way to monitor community level infections, although that is still very much a developing science. It is, however, not really a planning issue as itself. It is a possible thing, though, that the region may want to consider as a measure to implement. So the virus itself is not really a direct impact on wastewater infrastructure. The concerns are probably more about the indirect effects or potential indirect effects. And so we've kind of broken this up into impacts on the quantities of wastewater that might be generated during a pandemic. And then subsequently, we'll talk about the properties or the quality of the wastewater that's generated. And so this table tries to intuit, based upon changes that were happening in the community during the height of the pandemic, how the quantity of wastewater that might be generated and discharged into sewers might change. And so certainly we've seen some industries and so on that were shut down. And so in some communities, industrial contributions to the sewer system can be significant. And one would expect to see a reduction in the quantity of wastewater that would need to be handled. In other cases, things like increased activity at healthcare facilities might generate more wastewaters, and those wastewaters might have some very unique properties or challenging properties. Other things, other major changes, changes in commuter activity with the region of Waterloo. We have people leaving, commuting out, people commuting back in. It's a little unknown as to how that would affect the quantity of wastewater generated. Certainly, we had a lot of university students that would have left the region, and their contributions to sewage generation would likely be reduced. We see a lot more hand washing and so on, frequent and quantities, and that might increase the quantity of wastewater. We did a brief review of the wastewater generation in the region during this early days of this pandemic, and it suggested that it seemed to all come out in the wash, that there wasn't a significant change from historical trends. But there is evidence in other communities where they did see either significant increases or significant reductions in the quantity of wastewater generated. And so, even going within our region, different parts of the region may, in subsequent cases or in, say, rebound situations, there may be some evolution here. Moving on and looking at wastewater quality issues, there's the wastewater that we generate has really got the fingerprints of what's going on in the community. And so when we see significant changes in community activities in response to pandemics, there's likely going to translate into the wastewater discharges. And so if we use a lot more cleansers and disinfectants, or if we're using antiviral drugs and antibiotic drugs or analgesics, increased use of sanitary wipes and masks and so on, all of these materials are likely going to show up at higher levels in the wastewaters that we are generating. And as we'll see later, their presence could have implications both with respect to our ability to treat the wastewater, but also also to potentially even just convey the wastewater to the treatment plants in the sewer system. There are other things that could be happening. So if you have large industries that are having to discharge materials because they can't sell them or move them, then sometimes those things can be dynamically spiked into the wastewater system and cause challenges. And even just changes in consumer habits could have implications for wastewater. So one of the big concerns with respect to wastewater conveyance is if we saw a lot more of fats and greases being discharged in the sewer system because there's a lot more at-home cooking going on, and there'd be less control of that, and the presence of those materials might impact on wastewater conveyance systems. So moving on to the next slide. Before I talk about sort of what the implications of those wastewater, those changes in quantity and quality are, I talk about a specific issue that has a connotation in the planning process, and that is the use of the term resilience versus robustness of wastewater infrastructure. So the plans that we have tend to speak to resilience. And resilience really refers to the ability of a system or an infrastructure to basically bounce back after a shock or a challenge. And that there can be a certain loss of performance during that time, but the system can respond to its original state. Whereas robustness requires a higher level of treatment or performance. It means that the system needs to continue its level of treatment or performance throughout the challenging condition. And there's a lot of talk of resilience or there's some talk of resilience in the planning documents. And a lot of the context for that, I believe, is dealing with things like climate change impacts. So where we see short-term pulses like flooding and so on, and needing systems that can respond after those short-term challenging situations. As what we're seeing with the pandemic is that it is lasting for a very long time. And in that context, resilience is perhaps not the right term to be using, because our systems really can't lose their performance for such an extended period of time. We really need robust wastewater treatment systems that can continue to provide a level of treatment through and performance throughout a pandemic scenario. So having said that, move on to my final slide, and that is what would be the implications of some of these changes in wastewater quantities and qualities with respect to the wastewater infrastructure. And really, when we think about wastewater infrastructure, we're thinking about the ability to convey wastewaters from their source to the treatment, which is primarily the sewer and sewage system. And then the ability to treat those wastewaters to produce final effluents that will have limit or minimal effects on the environment. And so when we look at the quantity issue and the ability to convey wastewaters, our sewers will fail when our flows exceed capacity. So either when we have elevated flows beyond the capacity of the sewers, or the capacity of the sewers to convey the wastewaters are reduced. By and large, our guidelines for designing of sewers allow us to handle relatively high flows under many situations, but they don't necessarily account for the effect of clogging that might happen when we see a combination of what we would consider non-flushables, things like wipes and masks being discharged into the sewer system, along with elevated levels of fats, oils, and greases. And so if we see a scenario under a pandemic situation where we have a combination of, say, discharge of these materials into the sewer system that are going to reduce the capacity, and then perhaps a high flow event, as such we see in a seasonal, again, a spring season, that combination could lead to problems with conveyance, at least in localized scenarios. And that is something that perhaps needs to be at least considered when looking at the planning of sewer systems. The other implications I have here are all really related to treatment. And we saw earlier that, pandemics might lead to a lot of biocides and antibiotics and so on being discharged into a sewer system, at least under a very severe infection scenario. We rely heavily on biological treatment processes to treat our wastewaters, and it's conceivable that under a severe scenario, these antibiotics and so on that are biologically active might potentially inactivate some of our wastewater treatment processes. And we should be thinking about measures to prevent that from happening. And not only do those kinds of materials have impacts on the treatment process itself, or could have impacts, we know that wastewater treatment plants do not perfectly remove these kinds of drugs and pharmaceuticals from the wastewater. So if there are elevated discharges into the wastewater system, a fraction of those will make their way into the downstream system, in our case, largely the Grand River, and could have impacts on aquatic life there. And that also would provide incentive to try and minimize those discharges in designs and plans. And kind of related to that issue, but different, is that the presence of high levels of antibiotics can also lead to the discharge of antibiotic resistant organisms into the environment, and which could then have it be recycled back into our population and impact our long-term public health. So I think my time is just up, and I'll pass on now to Bruce McVicker.
So I'm not sure if Bruce is on the line with us, so could we maybe advance to the next presenter then in the series? That would be Camilla. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I will be talking about the drinking water sector. Can I have the next slide, please? So for the drinking water sector, we identified 4 areas of potential impact. In the interest of time, I will only talk about the first 3 today. The 4th one, which is related to operational and maintenance challenges, is mentioned in our white paper. Next slide, please. So the first question we tried to answer was whether COVID-19 is a threat for drinking water sources. For any virus to be a threat to water sources, it has to be present in an infectious form in the discharges of the infected individuals to the sewer system. It also has to be persistent in the sewage environment. Some research has been done in this area on the virus that causes COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, and it seems that the risk of transmission of COVID-19 through the fecal-oral pathway is low. Additionally, this virus has not been detected in an infectious form in treated or raw wastewater. The next question we looked into was whether in an unlikely event of source water contamination with SARS-CoV-2 virus, drinking water treatment processes would be effective in inactivating and removing it for supply of safe drinking water. Drinking water treatment processes are designed to remove a number of pathogens, including viruses. And some of these pathogens in general are a lot more resistant to treatment compared to viruses. Although no direct experiments have been done on SARS-CoV-2 in relation to its removal and inactivation in drinking water treatments, based on what we know about its characteristics compared to other pathogens, it is thought that conventional and centralized drinking water treatment processes are effective in its removal and inactivation. Next slide, please. The second area we looked at was the effect on water consumption. Due to the stay-at-home orders and the new normal of working from home for many occupations, in addition to increased hand washing and surface cleaning, it is likely that the residential water consumption patterns have changed. It is recommended that water consumption from the different periods of the pandemic to be assessed, and if there has been significant changes, implications for the region's water efficiency plans, and also for the distribution system during high demand conditions should be further assessed. Next slide, please. And the last area we looked at was the prolonged stagnation of water in the service line and premise plumbing. Due to the pandemic shutdowns, many buildings had low or no water use for weeks or months. Water that has been sitting stagnant in premise plumbing for a long time is not safe for consumption, as it might contain chemical or microbiological contaminants. To restore water quality in a building, the building plumbing and service line needs to be thoroughly flushed. This is the responsibility of building owners. Fortunately, this issue gained a lot of attention prior to the reopening phase of the pandemic, and guidance for proper building plumbing flushing were made available for the building owners. This is one pandemic experience which we can take advantage of for proactively reducing building water system health risks and developing preventative plans such as site-specific routine flushing. So that's all for drinking water. Annalisa, please take it away.
So hi, I'm Annalisa, and I'll present the infrastructure asset management topic. So this section comes last in the series because it brings together common aspects of the water-related infrastructure and more directly how to manage infrastructure, invest in it, and maintain it at an adequate level of service. Next slide, yeah. So asset management consists of knowing which assets you have and how much they are worth, assessing their condition, deciding if they need to be renewed or replaced, and successfully financing the necessary capital improvements. So the region is responsible for supplying drinking water and treating the wastewater of all the local municipalities, in addition to distributing potable water and collecting wastewater in the townships of North Dumfries and Wellesley. The estimated replacement value for these assets is close to $2 billion, and they represent 37% of the region's asset portfolio. So regarding the assets conditions, 51% are in good or very good condition, 38% in fair condition, and 11% in poor or very poor condition. When we have to decide what to do with an asset, we know that small but timely renewal investments save money when compared to just letting the asset deteriorate and replace it at the end of its useful life. However, financing capital improvements is very challenging, as the money usually comes from user fees and government funding, to the point where it was recently ranked the second most pressing issue facing the water industry. In the next slide, we have divided the potential COVID-19 challenges for water utilities in short, medium, and long-term challenges. So in the short term, utilities had to sustain operations while adapting to the new work policies and procurement challenges, for instance, for procuring PPEs. Also, data from an AWWA survey points out that only 11% of water utilities had a specific contingency plan for a pandemic scenario. However, the most pressing challenge right now is the negative impact on cash flow caused by customer relief measures, as the suspension of water shutoffs and payment deferrals, and a steep reduction in non-residential water consumption. On the top of that, we have the deferral of planned fees increases, further jeopardizing revenues. In the long term, we foresee difficulties in financing planning capital improvements, which may cause the deferral of some planned projects with possible implications to levels of service. Next slide, please. Some of the opportunities for the region of Waterloo include reviewing the contingency plans. So now that we have accepted that unlikely scenarios do occur from time to time, like this pandemic, no one ever imagined that, it could be beneficial to reassess, for instance, climate change scenarios for contingency plans. Also, increase operation automation to increase systems autonomy, as Joel's put so well. Explore alternative funding options. So sure, let's plan for the shovel-ready projects, but let's also consider other alternatives like P3 projects. And we will likely not have enough funding available for planned capital projects. So reviewing decision-making criteria for project prioritization is paramount. For instance, projects that would increase infrastructure resilience or system automation will have preference over the ones that don't. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the alternatives for overcoming challenges could focus on automation and data management solutions. So data management is key for identifying what assets need to be renewed or replaced and when. And automation would increase the system's autonomy and potentially reduce operational costs, which is our second point. So this is something the region already focuses on, but that could be expanded, especially by studying new technologies to reduce energy consumption, chemicals, and personnel costs. And finally, we're evaluating the long-term financial planning including how to prioritize and fund future projects, could be beneficial to identify and address infrastructure gaps. So I just want to leave you with one thought, and it is, we never know what the next crisis will bring, so we have to insert flexibility in how we manage assets, be consistent about project prioritization, and plan for infrastructure resilience. Thanks.
Hello. Hello. Okay, so I think I'm live now. Sorry for the mix-up. If everybody can hear me, I'll proceed here. So we're thinking about stormwater. And in this context, we're thinking about stormwater. If I could move to the second slide, please. We're thinking about stormwater as a threat due to the flood risk. So that's commonly known, but we should also be thinking about stormwater as a resource to mitigate what are long-term and potentially much more significant risks of biodiversity loss and climate change. So if you haven't been thinking about stormwater recently, and probably most of you have not, it's not just about drainage. So on the right is an example of a greenfield development plan that first identified the existing drainage and the natural heritage features within this block formed by the streets A through D. So in this case, there were wetlands in the middle of the block and some ditches from the farmers' fields that were identified as locations for possible stormwater management strategies. And they implemented an overall strategy of low impact development. So it's generally recognized that flood and climate change resilience is maximized when we maintain and enhance the natural heritage of the landscape as part of the urban development. So Matt Iannetta, my co-authors, research is actually related to this, as we're asking the question of whether the urban development could possibly improve on the existing rural condition of the watershed, which of course has problems of its own. So next slide, please. The principles of stormwater management and low impact development are well recognized in the regional official plan. So some of this is just things you would have already put in place. On the left are a few of the relevant sections that make explicit or implicit reference to stormwater management. So I've summarized a few of the relevant existing goals as the need to, one, identify the system of existing and potential natural areas and open spaces to access or maximize their myriad benefits for residents and the environment. Secondly, we need to protect source water where stormwater can contain high levels of salt and other contaminants. So that's a particular concern in the Waterloo region. And then three, to integrate stormwater management goals with the system of natural and green spaces. So ideally, the green space network would be also a stormwater management network as shown in the previous slide. And though this is not always possible to retrofit in developed urban areas, we can look for opportunities to do so. So these goals show up in various ways in the current Region of Waterloo strategic plan, where focus area 3 is environment and climate action. Natural heritage appears in this plan, as does the goal of creating community-based climate adaptation plans. So these goals then trickle down to official municipal plans where things like sustainable development, green streets, and low impact development are emphasized. And in stormwater management plans where recent updates in Kitchener and Waterloo in particular describe recommended approaches that align with the overall goal of improving the stormwater management system to address a broader range of goals than just drainage. So next slide, please. So the good news that we've heard from Wayne is that wastewater is not a likely transmission pathway for COVID-19. So we have found no studies that look specifically at stormwater in terms of transmission pathways, but the wastewater conclusion likely applies equally well to stormwater. In other pandemics, again, as Wayne emphasized, this is not necessarily the case. So a continued emphasis on ensuring that there is not cross-contamination with direct wastewater connections to stormwater pipes is still essential. There have been some studies, again, similar to what Wayne was talking about on the issue of stormwater quality, because there is a potential for contamination with disinfectants and the discarded PPE, and that getting into the drainage system and the creek system downstream. So other research is also focused on the problem of air quality and the different rates of transmission in different cities. So why they might be higher in one city or the other. So air quality is strongly affected by things like trees, which from our perspective are really vertical stormwater management facilities. So the goals of improving air quality can be strongly linked with improving stormwater management. And then there's a number of studies that highlight the changes in people's movements and attitudes that make this moment perhaps an opportunity to implement changes that promote health and improve long-term climate change resilience. So last slide, please. So the conclusion from this portion of the presentation is really to emphasize opportunities. Again, I'm presenting your work back to you, but this is a good opportunity for green streets. So the picture on the left is from the city of Waterloo, where they've proposed a WooNerf system or a green street for Large Street near the university. So lower traffic means that this is a good time to do these types of projects, and they can be significant for stormwater management improvements. The second opportunity is based on the strategic goal of community-based action, climate action plans. So the picture on the right is from a SNAP plan in Toronto, where the idea is to create a plan for a developed area, identify the current natural heritage features and drainage patterns, and then look for opportunities to combine water and green space to add real functionality to the green space system. So for stormwater management, that means more trees, disconnected downspouts, rain gardens, bioremediation. This is a good opportunity for that. The number one barrier to such a plan identified by the TRCA is really homeowners' attention. So everyone is busy, but now with people much more aware of their local environments and this feeling that we were able to respond in a massive coordinated way to address a threat, the thought is that it will be easier to engage with communities to think about what changes that can be made to address longer term problems. So I'll hand it back to you, Clarence.
All right, thank you very much. So we're now going to move on to the second presentation in the infrastructure series, dealing with roads. In terms of our timing, we're off slightly, and I just want to assure everyone we'll get back on track during the Q&A period. And our goal will be to try and start Professor Mo's presentation promptly at 2:25. So that's where we're going to head. And another reminder to everyone to please, as you're listening to these presentations, there's lots of thoughtful elements to it. If you've got a question, fire it into the Q&A section, and we'll have a chance to not only address it during the Q&A period, but also the region itself would appreciate your questions as well. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to our road presentation, please.
Hello, everybody. I'm Sereta Nahiri, briefly Atta, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at University of Waterloo. And I'm pleased to present the highlights of the white paper entitled as Can COVID-19 Benefit the Health of Our Assets and Humans? This presentation was prepared under the supervision of Professor Susan Tai and Professor Nadine Ibrahim. Can we go to the next slide? Land transport is the most common transportation mode, and therefore roads and bridges as major components of this mode are at high level of deterioration risk. Consequently, in order to maintain the serviceability and quality of these assets, we need to plan and set up both time and cost-efficient work zones. Based on the current Waterloo Regional Plan, roads should provide a safe, direct, accessible, and multimodal transportation for all users. To achieve this goal, well-organized work zones and work plans by considering the possible impacts of them on the neighborhoods and societies is mandatory. Can we go to the next slide? These three graphs compare the congestion level of 5 major cities all around the world, namely Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, New York, and Rome, in 3 different dates in 2019 and 2020. The graph in the left-hand side demonstrates the congestion levels on March 5th, in 2019 and 2020, almost a week earlier than WHO's official announcement of world pandemic. This graph shows that the congestion levels are more or less constant in all 5 cities in both 2019 and 2020, very minor fluctuation. World Health Organization officially announced COVID-19 as pandemic on March 11, 2020. However, Rome was affected by this virus earlier than other 4 major cities. Therefore, local government had already banned and limited non-essential trips, which could be clearly seen in the bar associated with the Rome in the middle graph. Also, there are some signs of reduction in congestion levels of other 4 cities. Almost a week after WHO's announcement, on March 19, 2020, congestion levels dropped significantly in all cities in comparison with the same date in 2019. Based on the available statistics, Toronto experienced the most reduction in congestion level among all other cities involved in this comparison. Can we go to the next slide? Highway construction and maintenance highly depends on the configuration of the work zones, their duration, and the traffic volume they can accommodate. Work zones generally cause challenging traffic scenarios due to their nature. Road-related factors such as changes in familiar paths of the motorists, lane closures, and substandard surface of the pavements are some of these challenges. Also, alternation in geometry of the roads because of work zone can potentially heighten the rate of conflicts, major injuries, and fatalities for both workers and motorists. Higher user delay costs and enhanced greenhouse gas emissions due to longer construction periods, queuing, and detours are the other significant concerns associated with the work zones. Next slide, please. Apart from the limitations and concerns that COVID-19 brought to our modern societies and industries, it also offered us some unique experiences in construction field. Pre-pandemic, setting of work zones was only limited to off-peak hours, mostly nights, and it was not feasible to have full closures on crowded areas and highways. Nighttime closures were generally preferred to avoid high user delay costs and congestion. However, they had some other major issues such as exposing workers to more impaired drivers, less visibility for both drivers and workers, and several other factors. The stay-at-home order because of COVID-19 gave construction companies and contractors the opportunity of shutting down the highways and crowded areas without, or at least minimizing, the concerns about the user delay cost. Studies in this period actually showed full closures could be faster and more efficient. For example, the subway project in Los Angeles County that crosses through the famous Beverly Hills city is currently progressing faster than before. This project experienced many delays since the area was highly populated and setting up work zones were quite expensive and challenging. Also on August 15 and 16, 2020, a couple of days ago, Don Valley Parkway, located in east of Toronto, was fully closed for maintenance and rehabilitation activities. Although the VP is one of the major highways of Toronto, no significant congestion was reported by Google Maps in streets around it. The other positive impact of COVID-19 was on environment and climate. As you can see in this figure in the right-hand side, the level of air pollution reduced significantly in and around GTA. Initial studies show that this reduction happened because of less consumption of fossil fuels by vehicles and buildings, and big part of it are going to construction vehicles. Some of the details of responses of other countries and regions to COVID-19 are actually summarized in the paper, which will be available at the end of the month. Next slide, please. Last but not least, COVID-19 helped us to rethink and reevaluate our conventional strategies, guidelines, and safety measures. To have better comeback and recovery after COVID-19, we should first develop new and practical set of health and safety guidelines which are applicable and valid in broader circumstances such as COVID-19 and similar situations. And second, revise the contracting approaches to improve the safety and efficiency of the workers. Also, force majeure and details of its condition should be part of each contract to avoid complicated situations after events like COVID-19. Third, develop and invest on user-friendly online platforms that support direct and confidential communication between all of the involved parties. This can help to significantly improve and accelerate the decision-making process. And lastly, invest on recruiting and training new employees and talents for post-pandemic so we can increase the pace of recovery for future projects. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm done. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And now gives me the pleasure to just quickly go through the presentation of my colleagues, Jeff Casello, Will Towns, and Adam Fraser, looking at reevaluating public transportation in a post-pandemic world under this infrastructure theme. And just as a starting point, again, we've heard many speakers today talk about sort of the situation pre-COVID versus post-COVID and the continuation of trends and key priorities from pre-COVID that we're seeing today. So, why public transit in the first place? Well, there's many great reasons, right? In terms of its impact on the environment, in terms of its connection with our directions, in terms of more sustainable urban form. From an equity standpoint, the fact that it provides mobility, key mobility across the spectrum of citizens in our communities. And it very much is a complement to our interest and efforts to try and increase active transportation in terms of cycling and walking, for example. So, every transit trip is linked with some physical active transportation. And these were key goals before COVID impacted us, and they will remain key goals in terms of our motivations for investing in public transit. Next slide, please. In terms of the impacts on public transit systems, just as in the case in terms of, when we look at automobile activity and congestion levels, once the lockdown was initiated, public transit saw significant declines in ridership, obviously in terms of people's activities, but even now with increasing requirements to maintain physical distancing and requirements from a healthcare perspective, have certainly increased the cost for providing public transit, and obviously impacted the ability of systems to recoup to gain revenues that are so badly needed. So that whole balance of providing mobility and weighing the cost and the revenues that come in from the fare box are being significantly impacted as a result of the changes wrought by the situation with COVID. So higher operating costs per vehicle kilometer, greatly reduced revenue per vehicle kilometer. And that's something that certainly in the short term is going to require significant attention by policymakers and decision makers in our municipalities. So, what are some of the options? Potentially exploring new revenue sources would certainly be one of them. Next slide, please. In terms of what's going to happen once we return to a normal, whatever that normal looks like in the post-COVID realm, there certainly is a diversity of responses depending on where we are in terms of the hierarchy of communities, from metropolitan to mid-size to local communities. And the expectation is that, if we're thinking of major cities like the GTA, Vancouver, Montreal, that their transit systems are so hardwired into the urban fabric that, and the decisions that people have made about work-life, location and balance, that they will see a return to pre-pandemic levels just purely out of necessity. In mid-sized cities, obviously, the work has shown that it may take longer to return to those pre-pandemic ridership levels, again, because there are other transportation choices that are available. And in small cities where, quite often the transit system doesn't exist as part of the transit department, but as part of social services, because again, it is such an essential part of the community fabric. Those are the communities where we would likely anticipate to see the exceptional challenges in terms of the viability of their transit systems. Now, in the case of the region of Waterloo, certainly given the launch of ION last year, the argument is that it's particularly vulnerable because we had a lot of momentum in terms of transforming people's behavior, and the key thing being the transformations that we're seeing in land use as well. So again, it's not the sort of short-term, temporary, how am I going to make that choice today? But in making significant location decisions, individuals are hardwiring their choice of transit and in fact their reliance on transit. Next slide, please. So in terms of recommendations coming out of this work about the post-pandemic and the future sort of long-term view, very much, the region should be committed to the supply that is provided, an appropriate supply of transit services. And yeah, it's going to be costly, but it is key part of our social fabric and part of our community. explore new revenue sources for sure, embrace new technologies. And I know the region has run a number of pilots, GRT in recent years on that front. But dynamic supply options, on-demand transit options as well are something to be explored. And certainly, again, investments in bike infrastructure, active transportation infrastructure would be critical at this point, rather than, or as a means of trying to prevent increasing auto dependency at this time. And again, monitor best practices throughout the industry is another obvious recommendation at this point. So yes, significant impacts in public transit realm, but I think certainly the argument would be that, you know, unlike the case in some cities where there were explorations of shutting down the system, significantly scaling it back, that would not be the recommendation, obviously, at this point in time. So thank you. So in terms of moving now to the, we've got a few minutes left here to get into a Q&A session on our theme of infrastructure. So I will now transition from presenter to moderator of questions. And a first question, going back to our earlier discussion exploring wastewater, and if we could link to changes in terms of activity and where people are spending more of their time, i.e. not in the workplace, not in schools, but at home. Has there been a sort of noticeable sort of spatial variation in terms of wastewater flows as a result of this change in our activity spaces?
The evidence that we have so far hasn't suggested that there's been a net significant change in wastewater generation in the region. However, you know, to break it down, we don't often have the data in a really distributed manner. We tend to only have it at the treatment plants. So it's challenging to be able to actually go back and attribute to specific sources.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess, Wayne, for you as well, there's a question about, you talked about, I think it was a reference to people cooking from home and discharging more things like fat down the sink, which is not a great idea. So, you know, how do we sort of encourage people to adopt more appropriate practices on issues like that?
So I think the question actually talks about the formation of these things called fatbergs, which are really this amalgamation of fats and greases along with other kinds of materials that sometimes are marketed as being flushables, but are really not very appropriate to be flushed into the sewer system, and they all get trapped together to create this congealed mass. I think the real solutions to that are public messaging and public communications in terms of appropriate management of these materials in the home, and also trying to make sure that our diversion strategies are really targeting and, you know, being as effective as possible in terms of getting, you know, say fats and greases into a green bin stream rather than into a wastewater stream. So really, I think it's more about trying to ensure proper use of diversion strategies and encouraging the populace to do that.
Thank you. There's a question that they're related to use of water fountains and people, you know, traditionally using water fountains as part of the refilling in their daily activity. And the question, I guess, is consideration be given to making water fountains COVID compliant?
Yeah, so two considerations are needed for the water fountains. The more obvious one is that they could easily become a highly touched surface. So there is a need for having a sanitization station, disinfection station right next to it, and information for people to disinfect their hands before using the fountain. And the less obvious consideration is that if the fountain is placed in a location that is not used as much as it used to be used, so the water is sitting stagnant there and it goes back to the point I raised in my presentation that water that has been sitting stagnant in pipes or fountains here might not be safe for drinking. So there needs to be either a routine flushing procedure for the water fountains, or there might be an automatic water cycling program already installed for them. So like we do want public to know that tap water is absolutely safe for consumption, and like bottled water is not the solution. But for water fountains, these two issues should be considered.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, there's a question then I get about building trust back into public transit systems to reattract ridership or to, I guess, get back those riders. And it's a great question. I mean, again, I wasn't one of the researchers involved, but certainly, you know, I guess essential in giving people the confidence is addressing safety concerns and health concerns and ensuring that the proper protocols are in place and communicated as well, I think would be essential to try and get that back as well. And again, it's interesting also to consider the motivations for people. Again, not everyone will return to transit. Not, you know, those decisions might be taken more of a longer term view, as I mentioned, about where people choose to live and their opportunities in terms of work. And as other presenters have already addressed today, that whole notion of where the work location is changing. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in terms of commuting activity, but also in terms of discretionary travel activity, which there's not a lot of currently, but when we get to that return. Okay. So in terms of taking a crack at getting back on track time-wise, I want to thank everyone presenting in the infrastructure section, and again remind people that the presentations, the white papers will be available through the region.